Morning in Jerusalem came pale and quiet, not silent. Jerusalem is never really silent, but pale, yes. The light felt thinner that morning, as though the city itself had drawn a veil over its face. From my window at JUC on Mount Zion, I could see the stone roofs and the soft rise and fall of the city beyond them, all washed in muted gold. It was beautiful, but the beauty felt restrained, as if it knew what day it was. Holy Wednesday, Spy Wednesday. The name itself carries a shadow. It's the day Judas slips further into betrayal, the day treachery stops being only a possibility and starts becoming a decision. Palm Sunday had welcomed Jesus. Monday had shown us the temple and the tears of Jerusalem. Tuesday had led us through darkness under stone. And now Wednesday stood between hidden betrayal and open suffering, between bargain and blood, between the plotting of men and the obedience of Christ. I sat for a while before rising, letting my hands rest on the walker. I thought about Hezekiah's tunnel the day before, the cool water, the darkness, the awkward footing, the strange way the tunnel had reduced life to simple endurance. Step, step, step. It had not been frightening. It had been humbling. There's a difference. And today we were to consider another humiliation entirely. Jesus stripped of his garments. The 10th station. I knew Francis would say it gently. He always did. But there are some truths which come gently and still cut to the bone. After breakfast, we gathered in the meeting room at JUC. The room itself had become familiar enough now that it felt almost like an upper room of our own. Plain chairs, windows that framed bits of Jerusalem, the faint scent of coffee lingering in the air, a scattering of worn books and bags and shawls. Outside, a bell rang from somewhere deeper in the city, followed a moment later by a burst of voices from the street. Life went on around us while Holy Week tightened. Francis stood near the window. Claire sat quietly off to one side, hands folded, listening even before anything had been said. David had his Bible open on his lap. Father Maximilian Kolbe sat upright, gentle and alert. The Desert Father seemed, as always, half present in the room and half present somewhere deeper than rooms. Elizabeth Elliot sat very still, her hands folded over one another, her face composed, but not distant. Lucia had her sketchbook resting against her knees. Maria had a small notebook tucked into her bag. Liam and Sean were beside each other, Sean leaning back but watchful, Liam already intent. Aoife was by the wall, quiet and observant. Mom and Dad sat together near the window. Francis looked at us and said, "Today the church remembers hidden betrayal." No one moved. Lucia leaned forward just slightly, her eyes fixed, not on Francis, but on Claire. Something had moved. At first, she thought it was the light shifting against the fabric of Claire's pack. Then it moved again, a small, deliberate motion. Lucia pressed her lips together. "LSK," she whispered, barely audible. I followed her gaze, and then I saw it, a narrow, marbled nose slowly emerging from the opening of Claire's pack. Agnes. She blinked once, very calmly as if she had every right to be there, which somehow she did, and then withdrew just as quietly. Lucia bit her lip harder, trying not to laugh. Sean, catching none of it, shifted in his chair, completely unaware. Francis continued speaking. It is about what happens when a heart begins to divide itself. Lucia leaned back slightly. "Spy Wednesday," she whispered, barely containing it. "And we have a spy." She giggled to herself and pointed at Agnes. I saw and giggled too, but I don't think anyone else had been distracted like we were. Spy Wednesday, Francis continued, is not simply about Judas as a villain. It is about what happens when a heart begins to divide itself from love. It is about secrecy, calculation, the inward bargain. He let that settle in the room. Tonight we will go to Tenebrae. I saw Lucia lift her head a little at that. Aoife too. Most of us had heard of it. Not all of us had experienced it. Francis went on. But first, the station. He glanced down briefly, then raised his eyes again. Jesus is stripped of his garments. He did not dramatize it. He did not need to. Then he said slowly, "Friends, ask yourselves, am I willing to be disrobed of the false securities of this world, my pride, my pretentiousness, my selfishness, my vanity, my conceit, my complacency, my need for acceptance, and to stand not before my accusers, but before my loving Lord, naked of everything in myself that is not of him? Am I willing to shed the garments of this world for those of God's kingdom? Will I stand in the dignity and purity of his truth as mere dust into which the Almighty God has breathed everlasting life?" The words seemed to remain suspended in the room after he finished. No one rushed to speak. I thought of how often I think of being stripped as loss, reputation, control, strength, energy, certainty, dignity even. But Francis had said it differently. Not stripped before accusers, but before the Lord. Not humiliation as spectacle, but exposure as truth. Not a coward's cruelty, but God's gaze. There are some things you do not want to think about in a group, yet somehow it helps to hear them there. Francis did not press us. This morning and afternoon, he said, stay near the city. Move quietly. Don't try to make a project of the day. Let the day work on you. And tonight, let Tenebrae teach you. We spent the day differently than Monday. Monday had sent us outward into the life of Jerusalem, markets, walls, food, voices, movement. Wednesday felt narrower, more watchful. We still walked, but less as explorers and more as people listening for something under the surface. The city itself seemed to offer both concealment and revelation. Jerusalem is full of corners, thresholds, arched passages, small stairways disappearing between stone walls. The farther one walks, the more one realizes that so much of life here happens half hidden. Conversations in doorways, a woman carrying bread through a narrow lane, children slipping between alleys, priests in black hurrying silently past vendors setting out spices and olives and sweets. You could imagine a bargain being made here. You could imagine a betrayal whispered and no one noticing but God. David and I walked for a while with Mom and Dad, Maria and Lucia. Liam and Sean wandered together just ahead of us. Aoife drifted between groups. Father Colby and the Desert Father were behind us for a time, though neither seemed hurried. Elizabeth was with Claire for part of the morning. Francis moved among us in that way he had, never quite leading by position and yet somehow always guiding. Lucia had begun drawing again. She would stop suddenly, lean against a wall, and sketch quickly. Doorways, candles in a shop, the fold of a shawl on an old woman's shoulders, the angle of light on stone. At one point she sketched a hanging garment in a market stall, a row of simple tunics, pale and rough, swaying gently in the draught from an open passage. "What made you stop for that?" I asked. She looked at the cloth, then back at me. "It looks so ordinary," she said. "That's what struck me." "His garment?" I asked. She nodded. "We say it so quickly, stripped of his garments. But he had to be wearing something ordinary, something he had walked in, sweated in, slept wrapped in, something with seams and folds and weight." Maria, who was standing beside her, said quietly, "And then not even that." None of us answered for a moment. Farther on, we came into one of the busier stretches of the old city. Vendors were calling out, though not aggressively. The scents were stronger there: coffee, sesame, dust, old wood, orange peel, frying oil. Someone was roasting nuts. Another stall had rows of embroidered textiles, bright and rich. There were scarves, brass lamps, carved olive wood crosses, tourist things, and prayers all mixed together. I found myself thinking about coverings, how many things we wear that are not clothing. Competence, usefulness, wit, busyness, knowledge. Even suffering can become a garment if we are not careful, something worn in such a way that it defines us more than God does. I did not say that aloud, but the thought stayed with me. Liam, walking just ahead, turned and said, This city makes it easy to imagine everyone hiding something. Sean snorted softly. That's not just Jerusalem. No, Liam admitted, but it feels visible here. Because everything's layered, Aoife said from behind him. Stone over stone, faith over politics, beauty over blood, tourists over history, prayer over commerce. Sean gave her a sideways look. That was annoyingly good. Aoife smiled faintly. Thank you. Dad, who had been quiet, said, It's not always bad to have layers. Some things need protecting. Yes, Elizabeth said, having come near enough to hear, but eventually truth asks for simplicity. Mom slipped her hand into Dad's. What if simplicity feels like being left bare? She asked. Elizabeth's expression softened. Sometimes it does, she said knowingly. And then? Mom asked. Elizabeth answered without hesitation. Then one finds whether Christ is enough. That was very Elizabeth. Clear, not unkind, not ornamental, not pretending the answer cost nothing. Later, near midday, we sat in a shaded courtyard and rested. A cat slipped along the wall with that peculiar Jerusalem confidence cats seem to have, as if the whole city belonged to them by ancient arrangement. We could hear voices from another courtyard, water trickling somewhere unseen, dishes being stacked. The Desert Father had said almost nothing all morning. At last, Francis looked at him and said, Father? The old man lifted his head. His face had the look of weathered stone itself, creased, spare, impossible to hurry. Judas hid among the faithful, he said. That was all. No one tried to improve on it. Father Colby spoke next, softly, and our Lord still fed him. That changed the air. It is one thing to speak about betrayal abstractly, another to remember Christ loved Judas to the end without confusion, without naivete, without surrendering truth. David closed the Bible he had been holding and said, That is part of what frightens people about holiness, I think. It sees clearly and still loves. Francis smiled faintly. Yes. Sean looked down at his hands. I'm not sure I like being seen clearly. Few of us do, Claire said. Lucia glanced up. Did you? Claire looked at her kindly. Not at first. And now? Lucia asked. Claire's answer came with quiet precision. Now I know it is better to be seen truly by love than admired falsely by the world. That sentence stayed with me all day. We snacked on warm, fresh bread from the kitchen later in the day, relaxing, chanting. Pearl had been patient, remarkably patient, but the smell of bread proved too much. She sat beside Mom, very still at first, perfectly composed, watching the bread with deep, soulful concentration. Then slowly, inch by inch, she leaned forward, her nose extended, her entire body followed with careful dignity until her chin rested on Mom's knee. Mom looked down. Pearl did not move. She did not beg. She simply existed, very close to the bread. Mom laughed softly. Well, she said, breaking off a small piece, you've made your case. Pearl accepted it with quiet gratitude. No excitement, no jumping, just a satisfied stillness, as if this had always been the plan. As evening approached, the city changed tone again. The light thinned. Stone that had glowed gold now cooled toward rose and gray. Shadows deepened in the narrow streets. The call to prayer echoed from one direction, church bells from another. The sound crossed above us like threads. The shops began to shift toward evening rhythms. Some were closing, others still bright. People moved faster now, as though trying to reach wherever they belonged before darkness fully settled. And we made our way to Tenebrae. There are some services one attends, and some one enters. Tenebrae is entered. The church was already dim when we arrived, not dark yet, but subdued. The usual warm familiarity of candlelit worship was present only in outline. At the front stood the hearse, the triangular candelabrum, all 15 candles lit at the start, each flame steady and small and more beautiful than I had expected. Not theatrical, not decorative, simply there, real fire in real darkness. The scent met us first, wax, old wood, stone that had held incense for centuries. A trace of cold air still lingered in the church from the day. Footsteps sounded differently in that atmosphere, softer, more delicate. Even the rustle of coats and skirts seemed to change by the dimness. We found our places together, though not crowded close. There was space enough for each person to enter silence. The church held other worshippers too, but Tenebrae has a way of making a gathered people feel solitary together. You are aware of others, yet also brought inward. The service began. The readings were not rushed. Psalms, lamentation, passages that do not flatter the listener. The language of abandonment, mourning, desolation, betrayal. The words seemed to gather weight in the dim church and remain suspended there. After a reading, one candle was extinguished. It is such a simple act. A hand reaches up, a flame disappears, the church grows only slightly darker. But then another reading, another psalm, another candle, and slowly the room begins to change. At first you think, this is beautiful. Then after a while you realize beauty is not the point. The diminishing light begins to do something to your body. The eye strains slightly. Familiar outlines begin to soften. Faces lose their detail. You no longer notice individuals so much as presences. The darkness does not arrive all at once. It accumulates. That, I thought, is one of the cruelest things about abandonment. It often accumulates. Lucia later said that as the candles went out, it felt like watching the world forget how to recognize itself. At the time, I would not have known how to phrase it, but I felt the same thing. There was lamentations, and I understood for perhaps the first time why the church places it here, not as literary sorrow, not as beautiful grief for its own sake, but as the voice of a city that has lost its center, a people who have become exposed, emptied, judged, and yet still somehow able to cry out. One by one, the candles were extinguished. The dim church became darker still. I could hear tiny things now, the shifting of someone's shoe against stone, a swallowed cough, the soft catch of a breath nearby, the dry sound of pages turning. The smell of extinguished wick joined the wax, a faint thread of smoke, almost bitter. This, I thought, was another stripping. Light stripped away, confidence stripped away, our ability to see clearly stripped away. And yet the service continued. The readings did not become sentimental to comfort us. The Psalms did not soften their language. Tenebrae does not rescue you from darkness. It accompanies you into it. At some point, only one candle remained, the Christ candle. Its flame looked stronger for being alone, though of course it was not stronger in itself. Everything around it had simply been taken away. I thought of Palm Sunday then, of the crowds and the palms and the joy, how quickly public brightness can gather, how quickly it can disappear. And yet Christ, too, had shown more clearly when others fell away, not because suffering made him different, but because it revealed what had always been there. I became aware at some point of something small against Claire's side. Agnes had come out of the pack. She sat very still beside Claire's feet, not restless, not curious, just present. Her small body low to the ground, her eyes adjusting easily to the dimming light. While we strained to see, she did not. She seemed to belong to the darkness in a way we did not. Lucia noticed her too. I could feel it, but for once she didn't reach for her. She simply let her be there, watching. Hold on a second. Okay. The last candle, the Christ candle, was lifted and hidden. And then there was darkness, near total darkness, a church full of people and almost nothing visible. I could not make out faces now, only the rough suggestion of shape. The air itself felt different, heavier. One cannot see darkness exactly. One feels what its presence removes. And then came the strepitus. The loud noise crashed through the church so suddenly that several of us flinched. A banging, a heavy, startling force, as if the wood had been struck hard against stone, or books slammed together, or the earth itself knocked once again against the foundations. It did not feel polished, it felt raw. It symbolized the earthquake, yes, the shattering, the closing of the tomb, the violence of the world against the body of Christ. But it also sounded like panic, like rupture, like the moment when all the coverings are torn away and there is no longer any pretending that things are fine. Then silence, real silence. Not absence of sound only, but the silence that follows after sound has broken something open. And in that silence, the hidden candle was returned, not to banish darkness entirely, not yet, but enough. Enough to say that darkness does not get the final word. Enough to say that Christ has not been extinguished. Enough to say Easter is not yet visible, but already true. I have rarely seen hope handled so gently. As the light returned, small, steady, I felt something brush lightly against my leg. Pearl. She had moved closer at some point in the darkness. Now she leaned gently against Mom, her warm weight unmistakable, uncomplicated, certain. While everything else had dimmed and shifted, she had remained exactly what she was. And somehow that steadiness felt like its own kind of light. When we walked back to JUC, no one spoke at first. The streets of Jerusalem were quieter now. The city still lived, of course, but with evening softness laid over it. Lamps glowed in windows. Voices drifted from doorways. Somewhere a child laughed. Somewhere a dish broke, and someone exclaimed. Ordinary life continued. It seemed almost unbearable, but also merciful. Back at JUC, we gathered again in the meeting room. The lamps were lit, but no one had made the room too bright. We seemed instinctively unwilling to dispel the darkness too quickly. Francis let the silence rest before asking, "What did you see?" Father Colby spoke first. I was struck by how patient the darkness was. It did not rush. It let itself accumulate. Yes, David said, like betrayal. The Desert Father nodded once, and like truth. Maria spoke quietly. I kept smelling the smoke after each candle went out. I couldn't stop thinking about that even when the light was gone, something of it remained in the air. That's beautiful, Lucia said softly. Lucia herself sat forward, sketchbook forgotten in her lap. I kept thinking about the Christ candle, not because it was bigger, but because it was alone. I think I always imagined holiness as radiant in a triumphant way, but tonight it was exposed. Claire answered her, "Yes, holiness is often exposed before it is vindicated." Liam rubbed one hand over his face. I thought of the station, being stripped, and not just in a physical sense. By the time the church was dark, I felt like all the little things I usually use to keep myself comfortable were gone too. Sean gave a short breath of a laugh. I was just trying not to jump out of my skin at the loud noise. That drew a few tired smiles. But, he added, more seriously, afterward I realized that's sort of the point, isn't it? You can sit there all serious and contemplative, and then something breaks in from the outside and reminds you this wasn't a symbolic little sadness. It was violent. It was real. Aoife looked down for a moment before speaking. What stayed with me was how little we could see each other by the end, and yet we were still there. It made me think about all the times in Holy Week when people will not be able to clearly see what God is doing, but he will still be true. Mom's voice came quietly. I thought about standing before God with all the things I lean on. Dad looked at her and gently covered her hand with his. Me too. He glanced around the room. I've spent a lot of my time wanting to be seen in ways that made me feel safe, useful, respectable, strong. Tonight I kept thinking, what if God loves me enough to take away the things that let me hide? No one answered immediately. Elizabeth Elliot finally did. He often does. It was not harsh, only steady. Francis turned to her. And then? She held his gaze. Then we discover whether we wanted him or merely his consolations. That landed heavily but cleanly. David closed his Bible and said, "The candle returning at the end. I think I needed that, not because it made everything better, but because it refused to spare." "Yes," said Father Colby, "hope need not be loud." The Desert Father added, "It rarely is." All eyes turned to me then, and I realized I had not spoken. "I think," I said slowly, "that Palm Sunday is part of what made tonight feel so sharp." A few nodded. On Palm Sunday, everything was visible: palms, crowds, joy, movement. Tonight, everything was taken away one light at a time, and between those two is the station, Jesus stripped. I swallowed. It made me realize how much of Holy Week is about being brought to what is true by having made other things removed, not just garments, illusions, crowds, control, false strength, even our preferred image of what faith should look like. It reminded me of when I had to give up so many of the things that I loved, that I wanted to be able to remember Bill, but they were taken away from me by law. Francis watched me closely but gently. "And?" he asked. I let out a quiet breath. "And I don't like it." That drew the faintest flicker of knowing smiles. "But," I continued, "I think I'm beginning to understand that being stripped before the Lord is different than being shamed before the world. The world strips to humiliate. God strips to heal. Losing Bill's stuff brought me closer to God. I had to rely on him." No one spoke for a moment. Then Claire said, "Yes." Only that, but it was enough. Francis leaned back slightly and looked around the room. "Spy Wednesday," he said, "shows us hidden betrayal. The 10th station shows us exposed innocence. Tenebrae places us in the darkness between them. Palm Sunday reminds us that public enthusiasm can fade. Good Friday will show us what remains when everything else has been taken. Easter will reveal that nothing given to God is finally lost." He paused. "And each of you tonight has named some garment you would rather keep." That made all of us smile, half wince. He did not press it further. "We go on," he said. There it was again, that steady pilgrimage phrase which had become more than movement. We go on. Afterward, no one hurried to leave. People rose slowly, gathered shawls and books and cups. Lucia finally opened her sketchbook and made a few quick lines by lamplight. Maria stood by the window a while. Aoife and Liam murmured together. Sean stretched stiffly, as if returning to his body. Father Colby spoke quietly with the Desert Father. Elizabeth sat still a little longer. Mom rested her head briefly against Dad's shoulder. David looked tired and peaceful at once. Francis and Claire said almost nothing, but their silence felt companionable, not empty. And outside, over Mount Zion, Jerusalem held the night, the city that had welcomed him, the city that would sell him, the city that would watch him stripped, the city that would one day hear again that he was risen. I put my hands on the walker and stood. We had come through palms and tunnels and darkness. The week was narrowing. The lights were going out, and yet not all of them.